Hello. Today is Tuesday, the second week in Advent, and there are the two candles lit. We're continuing our story of Bartholomew's Passage, and today's chapter is titled Dangerous Roads. Cornelius stared them all in the eye for a moment, and Bartholomew could see nothing but red capes and bronze shields in the street behind him. "We are to search this house for a runaway slave," Cornelius roared in a voice that rattled Bartholomew's bones. Then he noticed that Cornelius had a funny look on his face. He seemed to be trying to signal them. His eyes open wide, Cornelius kept looking from Nathan to the far side of the room and back again. "All here give heed," Cornelius bellowed as he continued to move his eyes. "Make way for the army of the emperor!" Suddenly Nathan seemed to understand what Cornelius was saying. Moving slowly, with Cornelius still blocking the view of the other soldiers, Nathan stepped backward toward the fireplace. As he passed Bartholomew, he tugged on Bartholomew's elbow and then led him to the corner. Behind the door now, where the soldiers on the street couldn't see, Bartholomew watched as Cornelius entered the little house and slammed the door behind him. Cornelius quickly picked up a chair that was close by. "Dorcas!" he hissed. "Scream loudly!" Dorcas looked too shocked to understand, but then the boy soldier threw the chair against the wall, and without any more prompting at all, Dorcas let out a scream that made the hairs on Bartholomew's neck stand straight up. Cornelius started throwing other things now, including a large urn which he smashed against the fireplace. Between Dorcas's screams, Bartholomew could hear other screams and the sounds of other houses nearby being ransacked, and suddenly he understood. Cornelius hurried to Nathan's side and whispered, "The engineers are shutting down the aqueduct in 40 minutes," he said in a rush. "It will be closed for 1 hour for repairs at Kidra. If you go quickly, you can escape past the checkpoints before the waters return." With that, the Roman turned to leave, but Nathan stopped him. "Thank you, my friend," he said. "May Jehovah richly reward you for your kindness." The young soldier paused, struggling with the conflict inside him. "If this Jehovah is really as you say he is," he finally said, "then pray that I will meet him properly some day." "That I will," Nathan answered. "That indeed I will pray." His red robes billowing in the quickness of his move, Cornelius threw one last chair. Then, with Dorcas crying loudly in the background, he turned and left the house of Timothy. Bartholomew sucked in his breath and waited. Outside he heard Cornelius yell, "All clear, centurion!" A minute later he heard the squad of soldiers move away down the street, and as one, all in the house let out a sigh of relief. "Jehovah be praised," Nathan muttered as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. A new and more hopeful escape route now open to them, the four friends quickly devised a new plan. They waited for the sun to move half a mark across the sky, then set their plan in motion. Nathan left first, holding his prayer box in front of him and chanting softly to himself, a shawl over his head. Then Dorcas loaded Bartholomew high with baskets of cloth and bundles of household goods, and they left in a different direction. Last of all, Timothy exited to watch from afar and lend assistance in case of trouble. As soon as they were out in the street, Dorcas began playing the part of a rich and finicky Jewish woman. Moving slowly, she'd look over the wares of each vendor, turning her nose up at most everything, showing interest in only a few things, buying nothing because she had no money left to spend. A few times a friend or two would recognize Dorcas and start to say something, but a raised eyebrow was enough to silence them. "I guess when you live among the Romans," Bartholomew thought, "you learn to speak without words." The boy and his mother worked their way toward the south end of Caesarea, where the aqueduct entered the city, filling the cisterns with water. A public bath was nearby, and that was where they were to meet Nathan. They were about halfway to the baths when Bartholomew suddenly gasped and hid behind Dorcas. "What is it, boy?" she whispered without turning around. "Husband," Bartholomew said, "my taskmaster." Dorcas looked around and spotted a tall slave leading 3 other slaves, all searching every face on every boy in the market. There were no side streets to turn into and nowhere to hide. Husband was getting closer, and Dorcas knew they had only seconds to act. "We cannot turn back," she whispered. "They would surely see us leaving." She thought for a moment, then said, "Bartholomew, drop the baskets." "What?" "Drop the baskets you carry." Bartholomew could not understand at all why Dorcas would want him to do such a thing, especially when it would make a commotion Hosba was sure to see, but having been taught to mind his elders, and with his old taskmaster just a few yards away, Bartholomew knew not to argue. He dropped the baskets. "Why, you foolish boy!" Dorcas screamed. Before Bartholomew realized what was happening, Dorcas had grabbed him by the neck of his tunic and turned him over her knee. Yelling with every slap of her hand, she began spanking Bartholomew as if he had just lost the family cow. "You stupid, foolish boy!" she shrieked. "I'll teach you to be so careless." "That's funny," Bartholomew thought. "This spanking doesn't hurt at all." Hanging over Dorcas's knee, all he could see was the stone pavement of the market. He could feel Dorcas hitting him, but she wasn't hurting him at all. Suddenly Bartholomew realized. With a great wail, he began to cry as if he were receiving the whipping of his life. "Please, mother!" he squalled. Many of the other shoppers laughed now, pleased that an insolent boy was being disciplined. "This is the 3rd time this week you've dropped my shopping," Dorcas was screaming. "Just wait till your father hears about this." Bartholomew's cries grew louder, and the crowd seemed pleased. Hosba stood watching, a suspicion growing in the back of his mind. The boy was dressed in rich clothes, but he was about the right size if he could just get a look at his face. Just then Timothy appeared from the shadows, looking bewildered. With a glance of her eyes, Dorcas pointed out the problem to Timothy, and he went and stood next to Hosba, arms folded, shaking his head. "That poor boy," he said. "She beats him in public like that 2 or 3 times a week." Hosba just snorted. "A much better fate than the one that awaits the boy I'm searching for," he said. "Oh, and who's that?" Timothy asked innocently. "A runaway slave, a boy about that size," Hosba said, pointing to Bartholomew, "but one not so spoiled." "May Jehovah grant you a fruitful search," Timothy said with a bow, silently asking Jehovah to do just the opposite. Hosba snorted again, and then continued on down the market, searching every face. Seeing that the taskmaster had moved on, Dorcas ended her punishment and set Bartholomew on his feet. Moving to block Hosba's view of the boy in case he looked back, she once again piled Bartholomew high with baskets, hiding his face. With a nod to Timothy, she took her son by the arm and continued up the market. A short while later, they turned a corner and saw the public baths. Bartholomew's heart began to race, and he wished he had a bucket of water to drink because his mouth was so dry he couldn't even swallow. With Dorcas leading, they strolled through the open square in front of the baths. When she was sure no one was looking, they slipped down the alley. At the back was a stone staircase that led up to a channel which carried the water from the aqueduct to the bathhouse building. Waiting on the staircase was Nathan of Qumran. "Greetings, friends," he said. "I was starting to think you might not join me." "A slight delay," Dorcas said, quickly setting Bartholomew's baskets on the ground. "I had to stop and spank the boy," she said. Nathan was shocked at this, and obviously didn't understand Bartholomew just laughed, his very first laugh since the Romans burned his town. "I'll hear of this later," Nathan said. "For now we must go quickly. The waters have already stopped flowing, and we have very little time." Just then Timothy entered the alleyway, and Nathan said to both of them, "1,000 thanks for your help. If I am not able to reward you, may Jehovah do so in my place." Timothy and Dorcas smiled and nodded, and then Timothy said, "Go now. We will watch the alley for a time." With that, Nathan took Bartholomew by the hand and climbed the narrow stairway. They turned a corner, then climbed some more, and finally ended up on top, where a channel had been built into the roof. The channel was about as wide as a cart and made of brick. It was still wet from the water that had been flowing through it only minutes before. Nathan jumped down into the channel, which came up to his waist, and then lifted Bartholomew down. The sun was straight overhead now, and it turned the water on the bricks to steam. Moving quickly, the two fugitives climbed the gentle slope of the channel until they got to the point where it joined the larger aqueduct. Bars of rusty iron covered the hole where water would leave the aqueduct and enter the channel. So Nathan lifted Bartholomew up on top of the large waterway and then climbed up himself. The aqueduct was so wide that 2 horses could have raced up it side by side, and deep enough that Nathan could stand up straight and still not look over the edge. Nathan lowered Bartholomew into the empty canal and then jumped down himself. Bartholomew looked along the long course of the aqueduct and realized that if the water suddenly came around the corner, there would be no time to jump out of its way. Moving quickly once again, Nathan led the way up the slight incline of the aqueduct. They passed 2 buildings that were taller than the aqueduct, and Bartholomew hoped that no one would look out a window and see them. Then they reached the city wall. More iron bars blocked the aqueduct where it ran through the wall, but Nathan was ready for this and pulled out a tool that looked like a funny sort of fishhook. Using the leverage of the tool, Nathan soon had 2 of the bars parted enough that he could squeeze through. Bartholomew followed as easily as a cat sneaking through a fence, but just as they were entering the short tunnel where the aqueduct passed through the wall, Bartholomew heard the pounding of the feet of a Roman army squad. The sound stopped just below the aqueduct, and Bartholomew could hear the commander giving orders. "You 3, he bellowed, "search the buildings of the temple. You 2, he continued, "search the bathhouse. And you," he barked, "guard the aqueduct at the wall. With the water stopped, they may try to escape that way." Together, several other soldiers responded, "At your command." Nathan had heard the soldiers as well, and looked quickly around for a place to hide. There was none. The shadows of the tunnel offered the only hope, and Nathan and Bartholomew hugged the side, having nowhere else to go. They heard the quick steps of the soldier climbing the stairway, then saw his shadow on the aqueduct floor as he towered over them. With a single leap that Bartholomew thought should surely break his legs, the soldier jumped into the aqueduct, landing solidly on his feet. Bartholomew felt Nathan tense, and this only made him more frightened. The soldier had his back to them and was looking back toward town. Bartholomew looked at the sharp point of the soldier's lance and the double-edged sword that hung on his hip. Trapped by the sides of the aqueduct, nowhere to hide and nowhere to run, Bartholomew felt like a fish caught in a net, and he knew very well what happened to fish when they were caught. He could almost feel himself being cleaned and gutted as the soldier drew his sword and then turned toward them. Have you ever felt as if you were trapped in a bad situation? Have you ever felt as if you had no choice, no escape, nowhere to run? Have you ever felt helpless or alone or afraid? In times like those, when it seems impossible that anything could help you, or save you, or comfort you, remember the secret God shared with us on Christmas Day. Remember that there is a name that is above every name. You can call on that name, a friend who is ready to help, a God who is standing by to rescue. Remember that name, and when all else fails and nothing else can help, call on that name, Jesus.